The reason why I sort of laughed when he mentioned Cathie Wood's thesis about deflation is that the Fed would never, ever let that happen because the whole point is that the Fed is using that as the boogeyman. Voter fraud has been a constant in America for really since the beginning.
There's always fraud.
There's always voter fraud. I think on a long enough timeline, you're almost guaranteed that fiat's going to die because fiat has always died. There's an irresistible temptation to print as much as possible. And currently, the Fed is still afraid of the people, but it may not always be afraid of the people.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Meet Kevin Show. Today we have a very special guest, Peter, an economist with the Heritage Foundation who posts daily videos on economics when the market is open. Peter, introduce yourself beyond what I just did. What did I miss? Your handle, profstonge on X/Twitter. For those of us who still call it Twitter, I do. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me on, Kevin. I'm an economist at the Heritage Foundation and PhD from George Mason, which is the mothership of Austrian economics. And I post daily videos on economics and freedom on Elon Musk's platform.
I love that. So what I think was so interesting is one of the things it really hit me is I asked you about deflation, mostly because we touched on Cathie Wood, how innovation creates deflation. And I said, are we ever going to have deflation? And you immediately said, absolutely not. Can you go into that as an Austrian economist, why you would say absolutely there will not be deflation?
Sure. So deflation is the natural state of a growing economy. Mm-hmm. So if an economy, if we're producing more stuff, then everything gets cheaper, right? You've got a fixed amount of money running around. You got more stuff. That means that the money buys more stuff. All right, so that is deflation. It's good. It's healthy. It's as the world should be. It describes really the past 500 years, at least in the West. So that's a good thing. The problem is central banks. So the purpose of a central bank is to take that natural deflation and soak it all up in money printing, and then hand the proceeds of that money printing, which is literally, it's typing zeros on an Excel sheet. Okay, it is essentially, you may as well be sitting there cranking a machine, just cranking out this counterfeit money. And what the central bank is trying to do is to essentially soak all that up and then either hand it out in the form of subsidized loans going through Wall Street, or to use it to subsidize the cost of government borrowing. So it effectively transfers all of that healthy deflation into free money for the government and free money for rich people.
And it makes it cheaper for the government to pay back their loans and cheaper for rich people to pay back their loans because you have a slight inflation.
That's exactly it.
Now, how bad would it be if we actually had deflation? Because that sounds bad and evil, but then I also wonder, well, what if we just had straight deflation and then people aren't, at least what we're sold is this idea, well, then people aren't incentivized to spend because they'll wait to spend, or people will be punished for being debtors. Is that as bad as they say it is, or is that actually healthy and normal?
It's super normal. It means that your money is buying more. People are buying stuff because they want to use it, right? Like you've got to eat food or you want to go on a vacation. If you're planning a Disney vacation with your family this year, the fact that it might be 5% cheaper next year, well, yes, but a vacation next year is not the same as a vacation right now, right? If you sit the kids down and explain to them, well, you see, kids, we can always go next year because look, you'll get 1.05 vacations. It's not going to fly, right? So, empirically going through thousands of years of human history with deflation, people absolutely keep spending. The sort of grain of truth in the deflation is bad thing is that there are two types of deflation. So remember that inflation or deflation, what you're measuring is dollars per thing. Okay. So there's two parts of that, the number of dollars and the number of things, right? So the healthy, normal deflation is when the things are increasing. We're making more stuff. Okay. That's the good deflation. The bad deflation, in theory, it could happen if all of a sudden the number of dollars goes down a whole bunch.
Okay.
Right? Now, why would that happen? Well, because the financial system creates quasi dollars, credits. Okay, and if all of a sudden all of those quasi dollars, so debts, if those vanish, right, because people can't repay them now, the banks write them off. That effectively destroys dollars. Okay, so before, people were sitting around with a bunch of dollars in the bank, and they were sitting around with a bunch of loans, and they were thinking of those loans as assets. Okay. If those loans now crumble, they're not worth anything.
The person defaults or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Then now what happens is people actually have to start, instead of spending dollars, they have to start saving those dollars up to rebuild their balance sheets. So at that point, you get this giant sucking sound where money, yes, drains out of the system. It's not in circulation anymore. The reason is that it's trying desperately to patch up the holes that formed because of the financial panic. Now, at that point, you ask, why did finance panic? And there we go back to the Federal Reserve. So ironically, the one very special type of deflation that the Fed is using as its poster child, why it has to exist, is the exact type of deflation that the Fed creates. So it is the scam of the century. You know, people talk about COVID, or I don't know, the food pyramid, or all of these sort of greatest hits of government scams. No. Central banks are absolutely the one. Yeah.
So now we generally only have deflation post-Fed when we're in a crisis. So looking forward now with a Fed, we shouldn't want the new modern deflation because it would probably mean massive joblessness. Would that be a correct conclusion?
Yeah, that's what we were facing in 2008, right? So that's exactly what happened. Is you had this massive collapse in credit, all of these loans that appeared to be good loans. Okay, they were sort of propping up Wall Street, and all of those crumbled at once. There was doubts whether they'd be repaid. And if the Fed had done nothing, then at that point, yes, we would have had a massive deflation. You might have seen the dollar go up 20, 30% in value. This would have been fantastic for consumers. It would have been catastrophic for Wall Street. With all these rich guys jumping out windows. Absolutely. The American economy would have been fine when the smoke cleared. But that is exactly the scenario. Now, the reason why I sort of laughed when he mentioned Cathie Wood's thesis about deflation is that the Fed would never, ever let that happen, because the whole point is that the Fed is using that as the boogeyman. Okay, so when you start to go into 2008 and you start to get that credit deflation, okay, that's exactly when the Fed says, okay, kids, it's showtime. Spotlight's on. We are now going to do our hustle, and we're going to, justify to the American people why we run their economy like unelected dictators. Okay, so at that moment, the Fed springs into action. It pours out hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. We saw a peak preview in March when banks started falling, right? So you had Silicon Valley Bank, then you had Signature.
They printed so fast.
It was incredible. It was like a pre-bailout, right? It was nothing like 2008, where the banksters actually had to go around Congress, right, threatening politicians. Okay, it was nothing like that. No, baby, it was just automatic. They didn't have to raise a finger. Like, they woke up and concierge service with a chocolate on the pillow. Boom! How many hundreds of billions you want? Remember, they were letting banks put fictional values on their assets, and they were lending again. I mean, I would love that, man. If I could just call my bank and say, like, hey, tell you what, I got some pocket lint. It's worth $1 trillion. Trust me. Here, why don't you lend me $1 trillion just to get me through this tight spot, and promise I'll pay you back. That was exactly what the Fed was doing. So at this point, the idea that the Fed's going to let it go to actual deflation, absolutely not going to happen.
So what does that mean for the average investor today? I mean, it doesn't, even though the Fed might be set up as essentially the scam, the Ponzi, so to speak, they could keep this Ponzi going on for a while. When's it going to break?
Yeah.
When and how does it break?
Yeah, so you've got two constraints. One of them is inflation itself. So there's one point where the people get angry, right? Voters get angry about inflation. The Fed kind of bumped up against that limit this time around, right? So a couple of years ago, they were at what, 9.3% or 9.1% official.
June, July of 22. Yeah.
Bingo. And sort of the whisper number was significantly higher because they have funny ways that they calculate housing, and there's all these little games they play to try to minimize the number. But anyway, so at that point, they were kind of bumped up against the edge of that, and they couldn't really print money. So they've got to raise rates, that they then know that is going to typically slow down the economy, right? So they kind of get stuck where, on the one hand, the voters could get angry about the inflation, but in order to rein in the inflation now, they've got to raise interest rates, which will make the economy slow. So now you get joblessness, right? So they're kind of juggling the two to try and sort of, they want to watch the edges where the voters are really going to get angry, right? So they would like a little bit of inflation and a little bit of joblessness, just enough to keep out of the papers. Because if they don't, then you're going to get political entrepreneurs in Congress who don't like the Fed to begin with, and they're going to start pushing for controls on the Fed. The Fed loses its independence. So fundamentally, the Fed gets up there and pretends that it's looking after the economy. No, it's looking after the headlines because it knows that there are two types of headlines that are dangerous to it, and it's got to get just the right mix. It's got to hurt us just enough in those two ways without putting all of it on one side or the other. So that's exactly where they are now, is that they're sort of trading off. They know that they've got to bring inflation down because 9.1 is not going to cut it. But then on the other hand, they don't want the economy to slow too much. Now, the funny situation that we're in right now is that normally the Fed has these sort of levers, where it can slow down the economy using interest rates. But what's happened in the past couple of years is that there's been so much deficit spending that even though they ramped up rates, and in fact, they ramped them up the fastest since the 1970s. I mean, it was really a panic hike in rates. Normally, when they do that, you would expect this economic crash. And we started to get just an inkling of that. Remember, we had 2 negative quarters.
Oh, yeah. And that was promptly, too. That was right in 2022, actually.
Yeah.
Q1, Q2 of 2022.
Yeah.
We very quickly got those 2 negative quarters. Now they're telling us Atlanta Fed GDP as of yesterday, 3% for Q1.
Yeah.
What's going on? Where's the joblessness?
Yeah. And the reason is because these deficits are just enormous. I mean, we're looking at over a $2 trillion deficit. If we actually go back and look at the change in debt, it's about 2.7 trillion annualized. That is about 11%, 12% of GDP?
Yeah.
That is incredible. And remember, you might see that kind of number during the absolute worst of a financial crisis, like in some random European country during the sovereign debt crisis or something. We're not even in a recession.
So imagine the money printing and fiscal spending and stimulus in an actual recession.
That's the thing, right? So recessions typically pile another 4 or 5% on top of that. You're starting to get the goofy town.
Oh my gosh. So what you're suggesting is basically, look, you don't want to lose the trust of the currency because then you're screwed. Inflation runs away. That's the idea of we've got to control the narrative, basically. Right. We're trying to control the psychology of people that eventually, as long as we tell them inflation's going down, they'll believe it after a few years and we'll be able to go back to money printing, basically, without losing the trust of the currency. But right now, the only reason we're not actually in contraction or seeing an empty, Universal Studios here and people are losing their jobs, everything seems to be bustling like crazy, is because of the fiscal spending, whether that's Inflation Reduction Act or CHIPS Act. I mean, I think Goldman Sachs mentioned the $387 billion Inflation Reduction Act is being so loosely interpreted that it's realistically like a $1.3 trillion package.
Yeah.
I mean, is that's just the name of the game now, eh?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
So when does this end?
Fundamentally, it eventually ends in a sovereign debt crisis.
Like Greece? Eurozone?
Yeah. Yeah, and what's interesting about Greece, so a lot of the discussion in the U.S. centers on can we repay the debt? Mm-hmm. All right, and on that measure, we can keep going for a long time, right? We know this because of Japan. So Japan's got about 250%, maybe 270%.
Twice ours.
Of GDP in national debt. If you translate that in the U.S. terms, you're talking maybe 60 trillion. Wow. Okay, we're at like 35 now. So it can keep going for a long time in terms of can they repay? But a separate question is, will they repay? And that's where Greece comes in. So if we look at Greece during the sovereign debt crisis, the European crisis back then, what was interesting is that Greece at that time, the amount of foreign interest that they were paying on their debt, okay, as a percent of GDP, it was actually smaller than the U.S. was paying at that time.
Oh, wow.
So there was not a crunch.
So it's
Greece.
Not a matter of being able to repay it. That wasn't the issue.
The issue was that Greece had a political entrepreneur who figured that he could trash rich German bankers and he could say to the Greek people, hey, you want to make a quick 100 billion? So default. Sooner or later, bingo. So sooner or later, whether it's Donald Trump or somebody else, some political entrepreneur is going to show up and they're going to say, Chinese investors who own a huge chunk of that debt, okay, they are the least sympathetic people to the American public. After Wall Street, which is the other least sympathetic. All right, so if I'm a political entrepreneur, and my plan here, my speech, my stump speech is that I'm going to tell the American people, you want to make a quick 35 trillion, stiff the Chinese, stiff Wall Street. All right, You issue new debt for the widows and orphans, so Social Security, Medicaid, the rest of it. Okay, so those you have to protect, or else
people will revolt.
You're out of the game. Yeah,
you won't get elected. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so, but on current numbers, that's maybe about a fifth of the debt.
Right.
All right. So you walk away from the 35, you reissue a brand new 7. Now, 7 trillion debt is perfectly sustainable for the U.S. economy.
Sure.
And what are they going to do about it? Finally, you tell the American people, finally, we can do something useful with this giant military we have. We can stiff the Chinese. It's a very, very appealing message. So now it may not work. I wouldn't be surprised if Trump rolls that out next week, honestly.
Oh my gosh. But there are a lot of Americans who own treasuries as well. Are you suggesting protect the Americans, just burn the Chinese?
It would all depend on the politics and how you put together the coalition. But right, I would expect them to protect any individuals, 401ks. Okay, so anything that's impacting regular Americans, you would want to cover those. But, holdings on Wall Street, you basically make a list of all the people who own the federal debt ranked by least sympathetic to most sympathetic. And, you hold an auction. You go around Congress and you try to get together a coalition of people and, you bring in whoever you got to bring in.
I feel like just the idea of that would lead people to dump their bonds and yields to skyrocket.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And, we've already got an inkling of that. Like over the past year, there was a lot of discussion. Yellen was addressing this. Powell has as well, how there seems to be this autonomous premium coming onto rates where it's, separate from what the Fed is doing. And, the Wall Street Journal kept wondering, like, where is this coming from? And it's people are starting to get nervous that this
Trump could do that.
Some kind of default scenario could start to come into view.
Do you think Trump will do it?
I don't think he will. I think he's got enough apple carts that he's upsetting at the moment, and he doesn't need more. He's also got one heck of an issue on immigration right now, so I think he's going to ride that. But I think inevitably there comes some point where it's guaranteed.
Some politician will use that as their leverage point, whereas Trump maybe doesn't need to right now because he's got enough weakness in Biden to attack or whatever. Is Trump going to get in, or what's it going to depend on, the economy?
Yeah, that's the ultimate question. And the polling on Trump is looking better and better. The Biden administration right now, I think, is really painted in a corner on immigration where they're trying to hold together a coalition that really kind of doesn't agree on a lot of things. You've seen it with Israel as well, where they've kind of tried to have a foot in each boat, and those are boats that aren't real close together. So, it's not a real comfortable place to be. And I think they're going to do the exact same thing with immigration. They can't offend the sort of open border activists, but on the other hand, the wide open border is polling really horribly. But I think they're stuck. So, I think in terms of voter preferences, that Trump's just going to go from strength to strength. And at that point, the question becomes who's counting the votes, and we can go there if you want to. I don't want.
Well, I want to hear it from you. Are you nervous about election integrity?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to be polite in case.
No, I'm so curious. So, to be frank, like, you're a professor at George Mason and an economist at the Heritage. I'm so curious. Like, I hear so much from all sides. Like, no, it's good. We checked, and then I was like, there's still fraud.
Yeah.
What happened in 2020?
Voter fraud has been a constant in America for really since the beginning.
There's always fraud.
There's always voter fraud. And the question is it a lot or is it a little?
Right. Enough to make a difference.
Yeah. So the idea that, if you merely raise the question of voter fraud, that you're a crazy person or that you should be deplatformed.
It's like anti-vax, it's like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
Right. So the first point, there's absolutely no doubt there's voter fraud. I grew up in Philadelphia, and it was legion. Like, the cops would bring the ballots in and they would sit there and spoil them in order to make sure that the right guy won. I mean, yes, there's absolutely voter fraud. It is overwhelmingly concentrated in cities. Cities appear to vote overwhelmingly Democrat, so one can guess how that's going to swing. The question is there going to be more or less? There are a number of states where they've tried to put in new laws to scrutinize it more closely. I think without a doubt, based on the data I've seen, that mail-in ballots are dramatically increase the scope of voter fraud. So I think it's a very real concern.
Is that because of harvesting, or why? And could the second part, could cities also be? I mean, maybe there's more fraud in cities because there are more people and more ballots.
Yep.
So.
And traditionally in the U.S., the cities have had much more tight sort of political machines. Just corruption across the board occurs in cities. If you're running a bar in a city like D.C. or Chicago or something, you're surely paying a variety of people. It's just, and this is always how it's been. Our American cities, especially older cities, tend to be almost Latin American in terms of how much corruption exists.
Are you serious? Just to get your alcohol license, let's say, or your permits?
Yeah, for sure.
Really?
I lived in DC for a long time. I was active in the nightlife community there, and absolutely, everybody's got to pay a lot of people. And of course, the elections is the source of the power in the first place, right? You can't exact any kind of bribe if you don't win the election. And so
if you're not in office,
So like the idea that these guys are dirty in every single thing they do, except that,
voting.
They're sitting there, we must respect the will of the people. This is naive.
Do you think the state of the economy is the number one thing that's going to determine like who voters go for? Or do you think immigration is a bigger issue?
That's right. So for the past really 2 or 3 years, ever since COVID, the overwhelming issue has been the economy. So first it was lockdowns and then it was inflation. Just to an epic degree, right? And we're just starting to see, I've actually got a video coming out in 2 days on this. We're just starting to see now where immigration is starting to pip the economy.
Wow.
And, most of my life, I've been an immigrant. I was 5 years in Taiwan, 5 years in Japan, about 5 years in Latin America, 5 is a theme. Always a legal immigrant. I understand the immigration issue, but I've also seen it from other countries' perspectives. And you cannot have an open border. No country on earth the only country that might do that is like Somalia, and not because it wants
Nobody wants to go there.
because it just doesn't have the resources. Like no voters will ever accept an open border, especially not in a country that's this rich. Yeah. To illustrate the point, so Puerto Rico has an open border with the U.S., right? Because Puerto Rico is part of the U.S. Roughly 60% of the population of Puerto Rico has immigrated to the U.S.
Oh, wow.
So at this point, there's about 3.5 million Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico. And then there's 1.5 times that, so about 5 million Puerto Ricans in the U.S. Good. So this gives you a sort of natural experiment. What happens with an open border where you've got a dramatic difference in income levels? So what happens when 60% of Mexico, Brazil, you see where I'm going, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
so you've got
Venezuela, whatever.
Bingo.
Yeah.
You've got 6 billion people who live in poor countries. 60% of that is 3.6 billion. The population of the U.S. is 300 million. It's not sustainable.
Wow. And I don't blame folks in South America for wanting to come.
I would immigrate.
I would do it
without
immediately.
a doubt. I have immigrated. I moved to Japan in the 90s because the wages were better. I completely understand where they're coming from. But the thing is, countries belong to the citizens. And if you would like to go into that country, like when I wanted to go into Japan, I couldn't just sneak in. I had to ask permission, and I've got to bring something to the table.
I like that line.
Skills.
Belonging to the citizens. The citizens have to allow you to come in, essentially.
That's the difference between being invited into somebody's house and just waltzing in. There's a very big difference.
Is legal immigration into the U.S. too difficult? Should it be made easier, or is it right where it needs to be, or is it too easy?
Yeah, I think, right, exactly. So I think legal immigration is too difficult. So, people who, for example, have entrepreneurial backgrounds or people who have skills that we need, whether it's doctors or engineers and so on, I think that those people, it should be much, much easier to come in here. The U.S. is such an attractive place to live that we should use the brain drain. We should suck all of the talent from the whole rest of the world. And then on the other hand, we should vigorously prosecute anybody who shows up and uninvited, as other countries do. When I was living in Taiwan, if I'd overstayed my visa, they would have thrown me and my kids in prison. This is how the world works. It's not because Taiwanese hate Americans. It's because they have laws.
Wow. Imagine. Regarding mail-in ballots, why are they bad? Because of harvesting or what?
Yeah, there are too many security holes. Okay. So, as we look back to the 2020 election, you've got the mules, you've got, sort of people showing up to people's houses and
collecting
and filling in the ballots ahead of time. There are just too many points. And in theory, if you had some neutral overseer, like, if the FBI or something were managing the entire process, then in theory, I suppose you could plug those holes. But the thing is that the people who would be responsible for the security of the ballots are the same people who are paying to rig the election. right? If it's like a local election. And so I think it's an insurmountable problem. Fundamentally, the security around voting, I think, should be comparable to getting on an airplane. They should want to know exactly who you are. Because remember, when you vote, you are effectively commanding everybody else in the country.
It's a really good point.
It's
you have the power to change other people's lives collectively.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So it's not like American Idol where you're just expressing an opinion, like, I like this guy better. I mean, you are literally taking over the country and you are controlling other people's lives. That is far more serious than getting on an airplane.
Wow, that's interesting. So abolish the TSA and move them to voting. Maybe not that extreme.
I'm just imagining how they would screw up voting. Yes, abolish the TSA. The second part is tough. Yeah.
If the FBI was in charge of monitoring elections, would you have full faith in election integrity?
Personally, I wouldn't, but that's a separate question on whether I have faith in the FBI.
Right, Vivek doesn't.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
What did you think about his campaign?
I think he ran a great campaign. He's young. It was his first foray. He doesn't have any political experience. So I wasn't surprised that, he didn't get the nomination, but I think he has got a really bright future. I think we're going to see him again.
I agree. Okay. So what about Biden? Is he going to get replaced by Michelle Obama?
That's kind of the parlor game in Washington, isn't it? So, is he going to stay on long enough to try to get... Okay, so one theory has it that they're going to keep him on as Uncle Bernie just until they get through enough primaries, okay, that it goes to the convention. All right, so the way that a primary works is that if somebody drops out of the race really late, then that means that when you have the Democratic convention, all of the activists get together and then they choose. Okay, so the voters are no longer in the picture. So that's the question is, does Biden stay on just long enough so that now they say, what can we do? We're going to have to do it at the convention. And then at that point, whether it's Gavin Newsom, your esteemed governor, or whether it's Michelle Obama or somebody else comes into the picture. So that's the big question. And the Biden people, underneath each candidate is this whole universe of people who are kind of running their world and who are grabbing all the power. And those groups of people don't like each other. Right. So I don't think the Biden team is going to be cooperating with this. Okay. They're not going to be thrilled about that. I think that they want their guy to hold on through the whole thing. And then the question is, what kind of Machiavellian, palace intrigues are going on to try to push one group out or the other?
The Democratic Party is very powerful.
Yes, it is overwhelmingly powerful. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. What about this idea of sort of going back to the economy for a moment?
Yep.
Jobless recession. Are we going to see that this year?
I have been expecting it. I was surprised how quickly spending ramped up. And I think the spending, they're going to try to keep up the spending, especially going to the election. I think above all, Biden or Biden's handlers really do not want a recession coming into the election. Once the election is over, then, there's not as much pressure. But
you're saying the government's just going to keep spending at least until the election's over.
Yeah, I think they're going to keep spending. They're going to keep playing games like draining the strategic petroleum reserve, to try to get oil prices down, things like this. I think they're going to basically use up all the seed corn, cash in all their chips to try to do anything they can to get to 2024. I think the result of that, it could be either mild negative GDP growth, or it could actually be positive. It could be like 1.5% GDP growth. That seems to be roughly where the professional economists are, is somewhere around there. So let's call it between -1 and +1 or +1.5. That's relatively anemic. It would probably feel a little bit like in the wake of the 2008 crisis. Remember, there were a couple of years there where the economy
11, 12, teetering, 10 even was,
right. So it was kind of flirting with 0 plus or minus. Of course, the economy does grow on its own just because population grows. So, it's got kind of a
the border
headwind, and then there's the border. Yeah, exactly. But yeah. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised either way.
Wait, are you saying open border, no recession?
The open border is funny because a lot of it depends what kind of people you're bringing in, right? So if you're bringing in people who are merely taking a job that would have otherwise been done by an American, then you've got no net gain in production. However, you do have a gain in spending because there was the city of New York said that the average migrant is costing them $144,000 a year in government services.
because of healthcare or social, essentially, here's your driver's license processing or whatever, unpaid tickets, rent subsidies, whatever.
Yeah, they're putting them up in hotels. They're giving them free food. They're giving them free, clothes, and the healthcare is a massive amount. So that shows up as spending. It appears that the economy is growing in terms of GDP. Now, of course, if you were to 144,000 isn't actually producing anything, right? This is in a sense destroying wealth. So for that reason, we could see robust GDP even as the country is becoming impoverished by this government spending. So the Wall Street Journal had an article about it recently. They talked about how over half of the jobs created last year they called it the welfare industrial complex, but they were either government jobs or government assistance. And a huge chunk of that was the migrant crisis. So you're getting this massive jump in spending, but meanwhile, of course, you have American veterans who are being kicked out. You've got American homeless people who are being kicked out in order to make room. So not all GDP is actually good for the people.
Yeah, that's very interesting because you're essentially saying, short of the loose border policies we've had over the last year, 2 years, we may have actually had negative months of employment already.
Exactly.
Wow, because you mentioned half.
Yeah.
So if you're at a 200K average, 1.2 million, to be about 600,000, remove that, you could essentially have 6 months in a row of zero.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And in fact, there were a number of states, the journal laid out the states, but there were a number of blue states where the government and government-related jobs, they were actually greater than all of the jobs created during the year. So in other words, the private sector jobs actually shrank. And I think this is kind of a trend that it's probably going to accelerate this year as they keep trying to pour out government spending specifically to win the election, where you're shifting towards really a Soviet model. Because remember, the Soviet Union had amazing GDP growth.
Tell me about this. I want to hear this.
For sure. That was, the big discussion in the 1960s and 70s. Of course, left-wing economists were all going on how we were going to get wiped out by the Soviet Union because they showed the GDP, and here was America going at 2.5%, and the Soviets were doing 6, 8, 10%, amazing rates of GDP. Because remember, GDP includes government spending. So, and the government can print money, right? So
they spend as much as they want.
Yeah, it's magic. It's amazing.
God. Should we be aiming towards this perfect economy with no government intervention, or do you think it's a necessary evil?
Yeah, absolutely.
Unnecessary. Don't need it.
Get rid of it. Okay, so without getting into the sci-fi, the sort of, with the private enforcement agencies and, the moon is a harsh mistress. Okay, without going that far on it, at an absolute minimum, if we could look back to, say, 1912, okay, before the Fed existed, before the income tax, by the way. So we look at how the country functioned in 1912. You had roads, you had all of the functions, you had streets, you had lights on the streets, you had a military, you had a navy, you had everything that a functioning country could possibly want. And back then, the federal government was taking less than 5% of GDP, right? So in modern terms, that would be on the order of about $1 trillion. Okay, they actually spend like $6.5 trillion. So as an opening bid, I'd say let's get the government down to $1 trillion in spending. Let's get it back to the 10th. The 10th Amendment, of course, lists out the things the government's allowed to do, and that includes almost nothing that it currently does. So you wipe out the 98% of government functions that are unconstitutional. You get the budget back down to $1 trillion. And at that point, we can pause and see how everybody likes it. You could, by the way, throw out the income tax. If the government reduced spending by $5.5 trillion, you don't need an income tax. So you wouldn't have an IRS. You wouldn't have to tell them. You wouldn't have to tell them anything about what you're earning. It's none of their business, right? The federal government could literally sustain itself on tariffs, sales taxes. If you had some kind of small national VAT, something like 2% maybe. It would be a whole different world. And of course, if you were to do that, right, so you would have no income tax. You could start a business. You wouldn't have to do any registration. You just do the business. If you're doing something illegal, then of course that's fraud. Fraud has been illegal for thousands of years. But beyond that, you don't have any compliance. You could have some guy could just go out on the street and, open up a little restaurant, throw out some deck chairs. And okay, so if you had that kind of an economy, you can just imagine how rich you would be, right? It'd be an entirely different world. So you'd have a much smaller government. We'd be 2-3 times richer than we are today. Just absolutely, a country like Switzerland would look like, Mexico compared to, the kind of wealth levels that we would have. So as an opening bid, let's aim for that. At that point, then we can sit and have the fun conversations about, the private protection agencies and all the sort of ANCAP stuff. I personally like the ANCAP stuff. If the discussion is, how we're going to manage space colonies that Elon puts on Mars, then yes, it's very topical. But for now, when we're talking sort of the political Overton window and what people are ready for, I'd say let's just get back to the 1912 economy. No income tax, no Federal Reserve. You got hard money, you got gold, you got healthy deflation year after year. In fact, if you look at the US before 1912, okay, so if you look at the period between around 1880 and 1910, that was the golden age of humanity.
Industrial Revolution.
The Industrial Revolution had started really in the early 1800s. Like by the late, so in that period between, 1880, 90, 1900.
More like Edison era. Eh?
Yes, yeah. They had really slow Wi-Fi though, didn't they?
They did, yeah. But they were on their way. I mean, it's astounding. Like if you look at the things that were invented in that 30-year period, it's everything. Gasoline engines, airplanes, electricity, computers, pneumatic subways in pneumatic tubes. In other words, Elon Musk's Hyperloop, they had it in New York in that era. It is absolutely astounding. You had robotic car parks where you would drive your Model A in, and then it would just like they have in Japan. And Americans see that today, and they're like, "Whoa, that's so high tech." We had it in 1910. The city of Chicago, when you delivered mail, they had a pneumatic system that ran through the entirety of downtown, and you put the mail in the pneumatic system, and it sucked up to the other. I mean, just unimaginable. This is like 140 years ago. What the heck happened? And what happened was the progressives broke it. They broke it with the income tax, the regulatory superstate, the Federal Reserve. So if we look back to the world where, my idea, when we get the government down to 5% and we obey the 10th Amendment, which is in the Constitution after all, the world that we get for that is that late 19th century world. And it's beautiful. I mean, people today, they watch Victorian dramas. Why? Because everything was awesome. The architecture, people would dress up to go to the park, right? They would have their gloves and the top hat. I mean, it was a civilized age. There were not people taking a dump park. It's a completely different world. But that is what a world of prosperity looks like when you trim the government back.
I mean, it sounds incredible and highly desirable. The issue that would obviously be debated would be the transition period, which seems like it would be somewhat painful to many people in terms of joblessness. And you might be in a depression, quite frankly, for 5 years or whatever it might take, eh?
It depends how you get there. So if you started off by lowering wasteful government spending, let's say on foreign wars, okay, so that creates nothing in the United States.
But what about all the safety it affords us and to prevent terrorism?
Right. Exactly right. Which, the attacks that we've had on our soil have all been because we get involved in foreign wars. So perhaps we should stop doing it altogether and just have a Coast Guard and maybe a border patrol instead. But right. So, if we were to get rid of the wasteful spending, the 144,000 on migrant things that aren't actually improving the quality of life of American citizens, and then you ratchet down the taxes alongside that, right? So you start with the taxes, the income tax, the corporate income tax, capital gains. All those things are incredibly destructive because they discourage people from creating businesses. Right. So you rein that back. You rein back the regulations, especially on small businesses, right? So if somebody wants to start a small business I was living in Taiwan and I had a friend who started an English school over there. And he didn't pay his taxes. He didn't fill out any forms. He was flying under the radar. And about a year in, the local tax woman comes to visit him, and she's got the local police guy with her, the police chief. And they come in, they have tea, and she says, "So, we know from the patrol policeman walking by, okay, we know roughly what your traffic is. We can figure out how much money you're probably making. This is about what we think you owe in taxes. Taxes in Taiwan are very low." And she said, "But we know it's hard as a new business. So don't worry about any of it, okay? You reach out to me and I'll help you with all the compliance." Okay, so they had a person in the tax office whose job was to help new businesses get set up and make sure everything's clean. And I laughed when we first talked to the tax office. It's actually true. And they have like English speaking, like Taiwanese Americans with like California accents. And they'll like come over and help you. And it's bizarre. It's all free. Why? because they want you to pay your taxes and they want you to create businesses because then you create jobs. It's a completely different mentality.
Well, just when you started with, they sit down to have tea. The IRS ain't coming over my house to have tea.
Yeah, and the reason that she brought the policeman was to communicate that everything's fine.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't to threaten. On the contrary, it was to say everything is fine. All is forgiven because it's hard being a new business.
Oh my gosh.
It's just a completely different mentality. And I think we used to have that here.
Yeah, but now I guess another counter argument would be, we probably ain't going to get any of that anytime soon, eh?
We could. If the government runs out of money, then we will.
Oh,
yeah,
so a large default event.
For example, yeah, this is why part of me is definitely rooting for the default. Yeah. If the government runs out of money, right, and specifically what happens is that if you default, then you can't borrow any more money. Because only a sucker is going to lend you new money.
Right. The trust factor's gone.
Yeah. So you get like an instant balanced budget. like for free.
Yeah. Nobody's lending anymore. I guess I can only spend what I make.
Yeah, exactly. And so they would necessarily have to trim back on a whole bunch of stuff they spend. Now the government is always going to pay their Praetorian Guard, right? So they're always going to pay, the FBI and the military and all these things. They're going to start trimming back the unnecessaries. And you've already started to see that in California, for example, right? Where Newsom is sort of setting off different activist groups against each other. So he's been squeezing the environment and, trying to put that money into something else. So you get that in this just beautifully concentrated form where you have this sort of gladiator battle between all of the different functions of government spending. Mm-hmm. And when you sort of sift through those, the one that wins, the one that defeats everything else is Social Security, Medicare, and then security services.
Right.
And
police, fire, yeah.
Yeah. And once you sum those up, you're actually pretty close to everything else has to get cut. Wow. Because of how much they're spending now.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, this is what I'm rooting for. You get the default, and then because of the budget cuts, and I would advocate pairing that with a boost in Social Security, because Social Security, as I'm sure you know, it's just a complete ripoff. The rate of return that you get on that is something like 1.5%. It's just a complete ripoff. At least people should get whatever government bonds were during that period, because that's what investors got. But right, so you would boost Social Security, you would cut off everything else, and like magic, you may have the regulations on paper, but if there's nobody there to enforce them, they don't actually exist. So the clean thing is to repeal them, but the alternative is just defund them.
Wow, this is so fascinating. I mean, when is this possible? Because I still feel like we can kick this can down the road, frankly, multiple generations. Yeah, I mean, they're going to fight this tooth and nail. Yep. Fed included. Yep. So when do you lose faith in the dollar? Well, I mean, what other currency are you going to trust? And I did think that it was also interesting, you touched on, not to tangent here, but before I forget, this GDP printing in the Soviet Union must also be similar to China.
Yeah, for sure. That's a big question about China. So there was a study recently that looked at light output in Chinese cities. Okay, and this is a pretty good proxy for how much how much economic activity is happening.
Modernization or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, you can just look at satellites and see how much light is there. And they estimated that the Chinese economy, I think it was overstated by something like 70%. by an absolutely enormous number.
Yes.
And you know exactly how it happened, which is that they got some number that year, and then all the bureaucrats were told, you better do better next year. And so they said, yeah, whoa, it's a miracle. We did just a hair better. And, and then you let that run long enough and it compounds. But yeah, I think they're absolutely going to try to kick the can down the road. That's where I think the Greece solution comes in, where it's not so much can they, but will they? Every day there's a wider and wider opening for somebody to come in and propose shaking it up. You start to get to the sort of Javier Milei moment where, he had really radical voice, but he had radical proposals that normally people would say, no, it's too risky. Yeah. But there's a point where people start to get desperate and they say, you know what, we got to try something crazy. So, in terms of how long the can be kicked down the road, I think a lot of that has to do with the personalities involved. So which individuals show up. Argentina, they weren't automatically going to get a Javier Milei, right? So you need a combination of the person and the moment. Sometimes the person comes before you expect the moment. Trump, I think in many ways was similarly disruptive, and things in 2016 were not really that bad. Like you wouldn't have normally expected a Javier Milei type character.
Sure, I mean,
show
that's
up in
40%
2016.
poverty and massive inflation.
Yeah, it's like 189% or something inflation. Right. So, but of course, as things get worse, it becomes more and more likely that he is some kind of disruptive character like that. And then the other question is the dollar. And, that's something that a lot of people have been interested really over the past year, partly because of inflation, but partly because the dollar is sort of a metric on the collapse of the entire system, right? So if you're asking how long can the can be kicked, the dollar is actually a pretty good metric. And the problem with the US dollar is that it's been the reserve currency for the world for, really about 100 years now. And which means that foreigners use a lot more dollars than Americans do. Right, so it's the dominant currency used in international trade. When countries are holding assets in their central bank, they're overwhelmingly holding dollars and things like that. So that's all good fun. The problem is, what if you lose it?
Mm-hmm.
Because the number of dollars in circulation in the world, or number of dollars in existence, nobody actually knows how many there are. So every so often, Treasury, the Fed puts out a paper where they try to spitball how many dollars are. Nobody knows how many dollars there are. But those organizations estimate that something like 2 times more dollars floating around in the world than Americans have.
Wow.
Which means that if foreigners stop using the dollar, then all of those dollars come flooding home. And there's only one country in the world where you have to use the dollar, which is this one. So, today, a rich Mexican, he is not saving his money in pesos. He's been around that block, okay?
Yeah.
He's got a couple months, spend in pesos, and everything else is in US dollars. That's true in India, it's true in Nigeria, it's true everywhere. If, however, the Federal Reserve, if people start thinking that it's not really a very good custodian of the dollar, that it's not real good about inflation, all right, so they start saying, you know what, no, I'm not going to hold dollars. I'm going to hold gold or Bitcoin or euro or Japanese yen or something else. If they start thinking that, then all those dollars come flooding back. And at that point, yes, we get 20, 30% inflation. That could potentially go on for a long time.
The dollar collapses, the value of the dollar's down, therefore inflation. Right. Interesting.
Exactly. And once that starts, of course, it can keep going faster and faster, right? Because once that process starts, where the dollar starts crashing, then, you get normal dollar holders, like people who don't really have an opinion about the dollar either way, like say Japanese banks. And they'll say, well, for them, it's just an asset like any other. They don't have an opinion. So they'll say, well, that's starting to look risky, get rid of it. So you get this just like a rush for the exit. Bingo. Yeah. And of course, there are several countries that would like to start that process off, that would start a dollar run, like China,
Russia
for
would love
example. Russia would love it. China would love it because they know that if you can cause that kind of a flood into the U.S., you would essentially knock the U.S. off the world stage for a number of years.
Yep. But then you need an alternative. And is that exactly the yen? It. Is that the euro? Do we trust those more, or do you just go to crypto?
Yeah.
And then you give no central bank that power.
Right. Right. And so those are really the three main contenders. So you've got other currencies. The yen and the euro are slightly less liquid versions of the dollar. They're seen in general as about the same as the Fed in terms of inflation and how good they are at running a currency. The other alternative is, of course, the Chinese yuan. That's not convertible. It's not a real good tool as it is to be a world currency. Also, China in general likes to keep it cheap because they want to subsidize exports.
It's been pegged so often.
Yeah, exactly.
Manipulated, yeah.
Right. So like when people were talking about BRICS, there was some discussion about sort of this China-led BRICS group of countries creating an alternative to the US dollar. I don't think they would do it as a paper currency. I think the sort of game changer and something that both Russia and China have talked about for a while is creating some kind of a gold-backed rail.
Oh, wow.
Okay, now that would be fascinating, right? So the gold standard, 50 years ago, the entire world was running on the gold standard. It's not science fiction. You can have a perfectly modern financial system with a gold standard. And if BRICS were to create some kind of currency that was redeemable in gold, they could use that to replace the dollar for trade. Okay, so, for example, when Saudi Arabia is selling oil, they could do it with a brick instead of doing it in the dollar, something like that. China would very much like to have that. And if you could get the market to actually believe that you're going to redeem the paper for gold, okay, initially nobody would believe you, right?
Right.
But if you actually have a gold window where people can like send their bricks to, someplace in Singapore or Switzerland, you initially do that to build trust.
Here's your coin.
And here's your coin back. Then at some point people believe it. If you had that, right? If you had an actual gold-backed currency as an alternative to the US dollar, and one where China was willing to sort of seed the market and kind of make the venture investments, to make that liquid enough, that could be a genuine threat to the US dollar. I don't think it's happening anytime soon, but the fact is that would be so massively beneficial to China because it would knock out the US dollar.
Right, exactly. So where does this put crypto?
Yeah, I was about to say, is the crypto the third one?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then once you get off currencies, then you've got either gold or crypto, right? And within that, if currencies in general collapse, then I think it would certainly be one of those. And I think that's been the case for thousands of years, right? So, many times through history, we've had currency collapses. Every single time, traditionally, it's gone to gold specifically. And there's reasons for that. Gold has a very nice supply profile. One of the most amazing things about gold is that over thousands of years, gold inflates, meaning new gold is discovered or put into circulation, at like 1% or 1.5% per year. And that's been constant for thousands of years, right? Think about the technology we had in like 1880 and the technology we had in like 080. No change. It's absolutely astounding. So gold is beautiful. I think that if currencies all collapse and, China doesn't get its act together and the yen and the euro, okay, if all those collapse, then I think the most likely is going to be gold just because there's a lot more institutional familiarity with it. There are actually bankers who started their careers when gold, was literally the backbone of the financial system. So I think that would be the most likely. Gold, it's not as liquid as a gold-backed currency.
Right.
Okay, so if some kind of like a gold-backed BRICS existed, then I think that would be more likely. But if not, then yes, gold is the highest alternative. And then the other one would be crypto. And so I think the most likely there is going to be Bitcoin. The reason is because Bitcoin has a nice supply dynamic as well. The supply dynamic is actually better than gold at this point. But beyond that, Bitcoin has a very thick social layer, right? So there is an army. I'm sure they're very vocal online.
Yes.
There's an absolute army of people who, fervently believe in Bitcoin. Many of them are extremely good programmers. And they pay attention to every twist and turn. They're really committed to defending Bitcoin. I think if you compare that to any other coin out there, so, Doge, for example, has terrible supply dynamics. Ethereum is a mess. It's a hot, I don't know if you've been following the roadmap.
Why specifically? Just because of the difference of the EIPs?
There's a lot of problems. Yeah. It's not really centralized. The overwhelming influence of one single person, the current roadmap on, V2, V3, it's very convoluted. I think Ethereum is a hot mess. It may turn out to be something really cool. I like it in terms of the sort of world computer hosting apps.
And to be clear,
it's
not very decentralized was what you were thinking.
It's not decentralized.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. I think as a money that Ethereum is lousy. I think, people complain that Bitcoin, it's too slow or it doesn't grow enough or things like this. Okay, compared to gold coins, it's fantastic.
It's much faster than a gold coin. That's
exactly. And, gold coins have served as the sort of safety.
I love that comparison, by the way. And that, gold isn't exactly the fastest way to transfer money either, right. But it's secure. You look, here's my gold coin, and Bitcoin is obviously very secure. Peter Schiff had an interesting argument about gold versus Bitcoin versus, say, the dollar. He said one of the things that the dollar has that Bitcoin doesn't is the government saying you must use this currency.
Right.
And therefore, potentially the only reason, we know Peter Schiff is anti-Bitcoin, but it's an interesting argument. This idea of because there is no bully forcing you to use Bitcoin, the people using Bitcoin are just speculating on the greater fool theory that somebody will pay more, whereas you need the government to support something. And so I think he also believes that the government will eventually use gold again.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's very likely. And, when it boils down to gold versus Bitcoin, I think a lot of that has to do with when the, Ragnarok, when the collapse occurs. So if we're talking the next 5 or 10 years, then I think it'll certainly be gold. You've got a lot more familiarity. Pretty much nobody over the age of 50 or 60 understands Bitcoin in the first place. And those are the people who run banks. Those are the people who have the assets.
How many people really understand it even under 50, I wonder?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. And, I think over time that you'll have a greater share of people who do understand it, who feel comfortable with it. Remember, you don't really have to understand it completely. Like if you ask your grandma how fiat banking works, okay?
Fair.
So like she goes to a bank and she puts her money in there and that gets lent to hedge funds in like Argentina. Okay, the money's not there. All right, this may surprise her, right? So, I mean, like in other words, credit cards, right? Ask the average person who uses a credit card exactly how that works. Where's the debit? Where's the credit? Where exactly? Nobody knows. They see other people use it. Nothing happens to them. Boulders don't fall on them. And they say, okay, good enough. It works, right? So in practice, the vast majority of people will never understand how Bitcoin or gold or fiat or credit cards work. They'll use stuff because other people use stuff. And so, if it's happening in 5 or 10 years, there are too many people who look at Bitcoin and say, no, it's crazy. It's all over the place. I don't get it. And they'll go with gold. If on the other hand, we're talking 30, 40 years from now, then I think gradually, people like it. When I look at the libertarian community or the Austrian economics community, if you look at people under 30, almost none of them care about gold. They all care about Bitcoin. Bitcoin specifically, not crypto, Bitcoin. And almost everybody over, say, 60 doesn't care about Bitcoin at all. They think it's goofy, it's a scam. They only care about gold, right? So, if the collapse is coming in 30 years, then all those 30-year-olds will become the 60-year-olds. And at that point, I think we skip gold and we go directly to Bitcoin.
What are the odds? 10% within the next 5-10 years, 50%?
I think high enough that it's prudent to have between 1% and 5% of your portfolio in either gold or Bitcoin. This is generalized advice, not investment advice. I'll just talk about if I were, I think broadly speaking, you want to have a combination of them because Bitcoin's got a lot further to go up. On the other hand, crazy things could theoretically happen to Bitcoin. It's never been hacked, but that's not to say it could not be. So yeah, a mixture of the two, but yeah.
Would you, what's your price target on Bitcoin?
No idea. If it took over, you can kind of back into asking, what if it took over? So if Bitcoin replaced the global monetary supply, then it would be something like 3 to 5 million in today's dollars, of course. As we get closer to that, it would be trillions because
everybody's using it. Yeah, of course.
And because the dollar would be collapsing on the way there. So in that sense, you can say trillions. But right. So in today's terms, something like 2 to 5 million, 3 to 5 million a coin, if it's guaranteed. And so at that point, it's fun because you can just say, okay, what % chance do you think that it will happen? Okay, so if you think there's a 10% chance that it'll happen, then you would say between 300,000 and 500,000. And, I think on a long enough timeline, you're almost guaranteed that fiat's going to die because fiat has always died.
Yep.
There's an irresistible temptation to print as much as possible. And currently, the Fed is still afraid of the people, but it may not always be afraid of the people for some reason or another. Perhaps because of mail-in ballots, but anyway, there may be some reason why the Fed is no longer afraid of the people, and so it just lets inflation run. So at any rate, if we could say that it's more or less guaranteed that fiat is going to die, so it's on a long enough timeline, approaching 100% that we'll either have gold or Bitcoin, and at that point we ask, okay, well, in the competitive sweepstakes between gold and Bitcoin, even if we start out with gold. Like if the collapse happens in 10 years and we go to gold, what are the odds that over time we'll go to Bitcoin? Well, I think Bitcoin is a lot more attractive fundamentally as a monetary base than gold. And the reason is because gold goes through these cycles where fiat collapses. We, go back to honest living with gold. The problem with gold is that if you're going to have a gold-backed currency, so coins are very, very, are very inefficient, right? Like,
gosh.
Yeah. So
manufacture of them, the carrying, the shipping, the security, the accounting.
Exactly. And, like imagine paying your Netflix bill or buying something on Amazon with a coin, right? So inevitably, once you're on gold, you're going to want to use paper gold. Yeah. And at that point, you have to centralize the gold. You have to put it somewhere. And you can't just tell people, so these are my gold papers and I have the gold, but I can't tell you where. Yeah. It's a secret place. Right, you actually have to tell people where it is, and maybe you even have to put like a camera showing them that that's the gold. Maybe you have to cut it open every so often to show that it's actually gold. All right. The problem is that the government can look up the address of your gold repository and they can come visit you and they can come up with creative uses for that gold, right? So this has been the problem throughout history, is that you go back to honest living, you have gold, that centralizes, and then government sees it. And now they treat it as fiat, right? So they hold that as their base and they print that paper. And so you have this cycle over and over again. With Bitcoin, you can break that cycle because it is not seizable.
Fascinating.
Right. So with Bitcoin, you can actually use it as a currency. You can buy stuff, whether it's Lightning Network or whether they have some better transaction technology in the future. You can actually buy stuff with it. It's much less transaction costs than gold coins.
Yeah.
So you don't actually have to centralize it.
The last question I have for you.
Yeah.
Bitcoin is not the best currency right now because it's so volatile in price. Do you think Bitcoin's ever going to stabilize in price, or do you think it's going to continue to be volatile, or is it going to go up linearly? Like, what is your prediction there?
Yeah, so that's easy. It'll absolutely stabilize in price once it's monetized. Gold, if you look back to the period when gold was demonetized by Nixon, okay, so over the past 50 years, gold has doubled or dropped in half several times over the period of 2 or 3 years. Gold has been all over the place.
Yeah.
It's been extremely volatile. Now, if you looked at gold since 71, 73, you would say gold could never be a currency. Are you kidding? You can't have a currency that doubles in a year and a half. No way. You can't base an economy on that. So what went wrong? Well, the thing is that once you are the currency, once you are the main money being used, you have this huge ballast of demand that stabilizes your value. Right, so the U.S. dollar barely fluctuates it fluctuates in gold massively. It doesn't fluctuate in terms of your rent or a gallon of milk because it is the money at the moment. But as gold gets closer to being monetized, it'll stabilize more and more and more because a larger share of its demand will be people, essentially speculating and holding on to it for that. Okay, and then if gold were remonetized, then we have thousands of years of history to tell us that it was stabilized. If it's not gold, if it's Bitcoin instead, exact same process. So as Bitcoin asymptotically approaches monetization, it gets calmer and calmer and calmer because a larger amount of the demand is sort of being held as speculation that it's going to become the currency. Once it actually does become the currency, just like gold, be super duper stable, be probably going by gold would be more stable than the US dollar ever was. Remember, Bitcoin actually, it's got lower supply creation than gold itself. And, gold had, even when gold was the money, it had various periods where drama happened. So for example, the discovery of the Americas was an enormous amount of gold flooding out into the world. That was very inflationary, right? So, if you were innocently holding your gold in Kiev and all of a sudden you're like, why doesn't my gold buy what it used to? Well, yeah, because the Spanish just brought a whole bunch. Okay. So, gold does have some problems. It's got some unpredictability. In South Africa, they could find a new mine or they could figure out a way to suck gold out of ocean water, right? The vast majority of gold in the world is actually in ocean water. It's just in such
trace amounts.
Yeah, right. It's trace amounts. But of course, if you had some energy efficient way to do that, and that's only a function of energy. Right. So if you have cheap energy somehow, say if you've got a bunch of green boondoggles that are taxpayer wastes and there's nothing better to do with them, and so you just flood ocean water through them and suck out gold, then so.
Wow. Okay. So why not, and maybe that is an answer, expose yourself to something that could really be denominated in anything, let's say real estate. Who cares if it's denominated in a dollar or Bitcoin or gold? I don't have to pick the winner. I just need to pick the asset that is productive in and of itself. And then if I want to sell it for bananas or bread or Bitcoin, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of both real estate and equities, actually. I think a lot of people in our space, who talk about dollar collapse and things, they tend to be really negative certainly on equities. Yeah. I'm not at all. Equities are real things. Like if you buy a share of Apple, Apple is real. It exists.
Produces money, exactly.
It is not a myth. Yes, they have engineers and they have marketing and they have products and we all use the products. It's a real thing. If you look back at Weimar Germany, for example, when the hyperinflation started, people were not sitting around talking about hyperinflation. They were talking about how much money they were making on the stock market.
Yeah, right. Because the value of your share, the proportion of ownership in the business becomes more expensive relative to the fiat, which is becoming less powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a huge fan of equity, a huge fan of real estate for the same reason, especially because the Fed works for you because, part of what the Fed does is pump out subsidized credit.
Sure.
And it's doing this partly so it can make life easier for the government. But, you can drink from that fire hose by getting a mortgage and, you're getting subsidized rates. I got like a 3.1% mortgage the other year when inflation was 9.1. So they're paying me 6%. Now it's averaged over years, but it's free money. Yep. It is literally free money. For most of my life, it's been pretty close to free money from the Fed that they're willing to give you for a mortgage. So huge fan of real estate. And, the only caveat I think is location. Mm-hmm. You want to be careful where you buy. One of the mantras in real estate is buy real estate they're not making anymore. But of course, they do make more, which is that they make highways, they make improvements, people move to places. Okay, so Florida, when I was a kid, Florida had basically 4 cities, let's say. Mm. And today, depending on how you define a city, it's got like 20. It's got like Fort Myers.
Sure.
It's got places that never would have been called a city at some point in the past. Why? Because people moved there. And so what that means is that if you were the guy who bought a shack in the middle of Fort Myers in 1975, you made out, right? On the other hand, if you were the guy who bought the shack in like Berlin, New Hampshire in 1975, so, there's a caveat to it. And that's why, I think it's important that, people like you can sort of guide people on what types of properties and what locations. But fundamentally, real estate and equities, these are both things you can drop on their foot. They're absolutely good places to park your money. Forget the prepper, boxes. Buy real estate, buy stocks.
Yeah, I also think, curious, would you ever buy real estate in California?
So you've kind of got to play out this long-term, almost a game theory where you've got to say, okay, so things get bad enough and then the voters do this and then they do the worst thing and then the voter, and if you look at a place like Detroit that really played that out step after step, there may have been a point once it was clear that Detroit had lost the plot. So let's call it, 1980. In theory, you could have gone in there, you could have bought up a whole bunch of houses for nothing, right? Yeah. And they're still worth nothing, right?
That's the problem.
I like it's like when you're buying into a city and you're deciding which neighborhood to go into. So my dad, used to dabble in real estate, and he would buy into the really, really bad neighborhoods, which is why I had to learn how to fight as a kid. And I like buying into the neighborhoods that are right on the edge of glory and just riding that sucker up, and then get off that one and go find the next one. So I'm not a huge fan of buying somewhere like whether it's Detroit or California. I like something that's a little bit more of a safe.
Got it. So specifically the riskier towns maybe stay away from that could either go bankrupt or politically or population wise.
Yeah. And, for sure you've got a bigger payday if it works out. Mm. But of course you have to look at like a venture capitalist, right? Mm. So, what are the odds of it working out? And then you got to compare that to all the potential losers. And so
one thing that I think is so interesting because it relates so much to our supply discussion is one of the things we're finding now is you go to Texas and we're seeing so much new construction in multifamily that we're starting to see rent compression to a substantial degree in certain areas like Dallas, where we look at an area that hasn't been corrupted in California, whether that's, maybe a part of San Diego or Ventura County or whatever, you can't build anymore. So you, in a weird way, are almost insulated because whereas you can build very easily and more quickly in certain areas, you can't in the edge of glory areas that are left in California, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been a big part of what's driven real estate in places like San Francisco or Seattle is that there are so many places that you can't build that, it's like a tsunami up a canyon, like it just concentrates it. And so the prices have gone up a lot. And indeed, like if you look at a place like Dallas, Houston, most of Florida still has tons of buildable land. And so, in terms of really making a mint, I think Florida is probably not as good as you would expect it to be for that reason. So I live in Orlando, and just looking at all of the land that they're adding new developments to, I think that they can absorb really a ton more people in Florida before prices necessarily go up. But then, of course, on the flip side to that, the zoning, it's not a guarantee. right? So, again, if we take Detroit, what ended up happening is they actually knocked down tens of thousands of houses. I mean, just literally they're reverting back to nature. So I mean, it's just horrific. Oh, and some of these houses, they're like Victorians from
early 1900s, 1908s, late 1800s. Gorgeous.
From the golden age. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a perfect side by side.
That was good. That was a good
back
one.
then you had middle class families building just gorgeous palaces with the stained glass and the whole thing. And then just knocking them down. So, but yes, that's a caveat. I think one of the funniest markets is when you look out west, right? So if you look at places like Boise, a lot of places in Utah, where on paper it looks like you got lots of buildable land, but if you actually look at the zoning maps,
the mountains and topography,
it's incredible, just tiny little slivers of land that you can build on. So I'd imagine that those are actually going to be really, really good. Places like Wyoming, where you have sane government, and then you may not have as much buildable spaces. Maybe in the western portion of Wyoming, not in the part with the prairie on it, because they'll just keep building forever.
Wow, this has been amazing and very insightful. What are we not asking that we should be asking? What are we missing?
Boy, we covered a lot of ground. Yeah,
that's really good.
Yeah.
And so tell us, where can people follow you, and where are you going to be posting the most? Because this was phenomenal. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it. I've been a huge fan for a long time. So no, seriously at all.
Thank you. So then X?
Definitely X. That's where I post most of the time. Elon Musk has been phenomenal on defending free speech. He did what Republicans in Congress didn't have the
bravery to do.
Bravery, thank you. That's the word. Most of what I do is on X, and then I'm also on YouTube, and I've got a site, petersandwich.com, where do Substack and podcast over there.
Are you gonna buy a Cybertruck?
I am going to wait until the kinks are worked out. I want it to be proper bulletproof, Kevin.
Good answer.
That's right. The places I go in Orlando.
Oh no. Okay, very well. Thank you so much again. Of course. It was a pleasure.
Yep. It was great being on.
Even though I'm a licensed financial advisor, licensed real estate broker, and becoming a stockbroker, this video is neither personalized financial nor real estate advice for you. It is not tax, legal, or otherwise personalized advice tailored to you. This video provides generalized perspective, information, and commentary. Any third-party content I show should not be deemed endorsed by me. This video is not and shall never be deemed reasonably sufficient information for the purposes of evaluating a security or investment decision. Any links or promoted products are either paid affiliations or products or services we may benefit from. I also personally operate an actively managed ETF and hold long positions in various securities mentioned, including potential short positions. However, I have no relationship to any issuers, nor am I presently acting as a market maker.